Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about keeping your brain ahead of your fingers. This is just one of those things that I was reminded of recently because of something I was practicing. I find that it's nice sometimes when I'm practicing, especially on an instrument that I'm less good at, because doing that constantly reminds me of things that I end up taking for granted on instruments that I'm better at. So I'm currently working on this Iwi part to play a. I'm playing Iwi for a bassoon part on a musical, and I honestly bit off more than I can chew. I'll talk about that in another video, but uh, it really is forcing me because of all the weird key stuff to really notice this issue. Um, there's an issue when you're practicing sometimes that you can be working on a finger pattern and you stop processing what is happening. So, and this definitely applies to piano, where you're working on some passage. I don't know, something. It could be scales. Scales aren't the best example because they become mindless very quickly and it doesn't matter. But you could be working on a passage and you just start to repeat it over and over, and maybe you especially repeat it very quickly because you're just trying to get some sort of quick finger motion, and you stop actually thinking about what those notes are, and you're not actually processing. And what ends up happening is that you actually you're relying entirely on the physical sensation of that, and later you won't have good recall of what that is. And that's especially important for what I'm doing, working preparing for this musical. I have a short amount of time, and I'm having to. What's going to have to happen is I'm going to have to read it. There is not time for me to memorize 122 pages of music. It won't happen. I have to learn to read bass clef and tenor clef well enough on Iwi, including all of the weird chromatic stuff that I'm less comfortable with. I have to be able to read that enough so that when I get to that tune, I can read what's on the page and process it in real time and play what's on that page. If I just sat there and I memorized the physical sensation, which it's really easy to do, I can't have. There's no way for me to have quick recall of that in the moment when there are hundreds of spots like that. So the point is that I really have to slow down and catch when I'm starting to do that, and I have to slow down and make sure I'm actually thinking, okay, this is this note, it's this finger, this is this note, it's this finger, and I have to think about that in sequence and get used to my brain firing those connections a little faster each time I work on it. And it's one of those things where I'm having to practice in a way that I would never tell anybody to do, but it's a lot of cramming for me to do this. But it's really another thing that can happen is you can get semantic satiation. If you're not familiar with that concept, it's like when you say a word over and over and over until it's meaningless, like it starts to be weird. I'm not going to do it because it's silly. It'd take too long for me to say something over and over. But if you do that, if you say a word over and over and over, it starts to just be these nebulous sounds that don't actually make sense in your head. And I catch that in music practice a lot, where you can practice a passage until you are almost dissociating. You're dissociating not even from just like associating the notes with what your fingers are doing. You're not even connected to what your fingers are doing anymore. It's this super disconnected thing where nothing is processing anymore. And that's one of those things that I always warn people against in that sort of mindless practice way. And I'm glad that I have enough experience to know to avoid that when I'm preparing for this particular show and practicing other instruments in general. It's so important to make that connection. Now, I will throw in the caveat, because I've talked about this before, that there are times that you don't need to aim so hard at the end goal. Because I've noticed this, like with guitar. The example I gave there is, I know that I should be able to read the notes, associate them, know where they're at on the fretboard, not look at my hands, and play my scales or whatever. But what I found is that that's too much. My mental bandwidth cannot take it. That's too much information. And I had to just focus first on purely the physical part of it. I had to stare at my hand, make sure I was getting those distances right, make sure I was getting the fingers where they need to be for scales or sequences or whatever I was working on. And then once I am technically physically competent with that, then I need to go back and make sure to do it slower with easier material and make those associations and connections. I think that is the other thing that people can miss. While I do think it's important to do a certain amount of just that purely physical rote technical practice, because like that is the cornerstone of your ability to have technical fluency on an instrument. What people miss is that they never go back and create literacy with that. They get the fluency, but they don't have the literacy connected to it, so they can't use some abstract, signifier outside, which is, could be sheet music, it could be lead sheets, something outside that they can read very quickly. And because the thing about sheet music and lead sheets, those things lighten your mental load considerably. When you can do that, you don't have to memorize everything. And that lightens your mental load, because if you've got to memorize an hour plus of music, that's insane. That's just an insane amount of music. But when you can read well, or you can comp from, a lead sheet, then you don't have to remember any of that. You just sort of have these little reminders on the way. You might semi-memorize a little bit of stuff, but having that reminder and having something you're literate in to remind you definitely lowers your cognitive load. It doesn't feel like that early on if you're not good at reading or comping and spelling chords, but in the long term, it definitely is. And I always try to compare it to reading English. If somebody asked you to, I don't know, recite the first chapter of a book, would you rather just read it out loud, or would you rather memorize it? It would take so much work to memorize it, and you would have to work so hard thinking about what is the next sentence, and you couldn't even think about the delivery. But because you read well, you could probably read it out loud while, it's in front of you, and you could give good delivery on that, because you could focus on things like inflection because you know how to read. And that's definitely a thing that happens with music. But yeah, you do have to develop that technical thing. Luckily on iwi, my technique is not zero. I'm not starting from scratch, but I still have to make sure to slow down for the spots that are really tricky for me. And I can sort of jump that line where I don't have to do just pure technical mindless work because I'm not starting at zero, and I can immediately start working on that stuff. So that's a big thing about just figuring out where you are. It's always with music, it's constant self-assessment of where you are as a player, and just being mindful to not let some of those things creep in. I think that's the real big problem, is that people, early on, I've mentioned this, if you're working through a method book and you have zero technical skill because you're an absolute beginner, you're going to memorize everything. As much as I tell people not to memorize and I tell people to read, you can't. You don't have the sight reading ability because you don't have the technical fluency to even start. So you're going to have to repeat it hundreds of times potentially, and that's going to lead to memorization through osmosis. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that later, if later, you never go back and create the literacy. So that's just something to keep in mind. What was my whole point anyway? I feel like I got off track of actually talking about the brain ahead of the fingers thing. So just be aware when you're practicing to know what your hands are doing. Don't let things go on autopilot. Autopilot's a thing that will happen in the long term, but you can't jump the line and hope for it to be there. People tell you to get to a point where you have that automaticity, and it's true, but I think you can misunderstand that and think that you should be completely dissociated. You should be able to play it by heart so well that your hands are fully in auto mode. But what I find from people who have that is they can't do anything different. They couldn't just play their right hand or just play their left hand. They couldn't be asked to start at a specific section. They couldn't be asked to play it slightly slower, because the automaticity they built in is so fixed on a very specific style of executing that thing that they don't actually know what they're playing. And like a lot of times, if they slow down, they don't actually know what their fingers are doing. It's that centipede's dilemma where if you think about it, suddenly you're like, what the fuck? And like everything falls apart because once you're conscious of what your hands are doing, you can't do it anymore. I have automaticity in that if I see whatever arpeggio in one hand and some chords in another hand, my hands know how to execute those things. But that is a thing where I am in control of what's happening there. I know what I'm playing. My fingers aren't just going randomly, and I could have control to slow that down, play it in a different way, play it, slightly different accents and stuff like that. It's the yeah, it's that issue where you do still have control. If you were asked to speak in English, it's the same kind of thing. Like, you have control over what you're saying. It's not a thing that you're just randomly like running. It's not like you talk and all of your mouth parts are making the sounds, but you don't know what you're saying. You do know what you're saying. You're able to communicate those things. You're able to have a thought and consciously think to say that thing. Now, what's automatic is that you probably don't think about the incredibly complex mechanism of how much air is passing past your vocal cords and the shape that your tongue and your lips and your teeth and your jaw are making to make this constant series of syllables. It's crazy if you actually think about how complex that is. That part's automatic. And I think that's where a lot of people lose the concept in music, because that is technique. That what you're doing when you talk, technique is what is happening with your mouth and stuff. And you didn't have to really work on that. That is something that developed when you were so young that you just can't remember that. But for something like a musical instrument, you have to go out of your way to very specifically work on technique. And I would suspect if you were speaking in another language that had lots of very foreign phonemes, or if you were working with like a dialect coach and you were specifically trying to match a regional dialect or something, that's where you actually would get into that situation where even for speaking, you're thinking very strongly about the technique of like, where is my tongue in my mouth when I say this word? And am I stopping this with a D or a T sound and stuff like that? But most of the time we don't think about that. But with music, it's all of that. You have to think about technique. You have to develop technique separately. Anyway, that's a whole. It's always hard to talk about these things. I wanted to just talk about the keeping your brain ahead of your fingers thing, but it's so hard to zero in on any one thing because it's all connected, and I just can't avoid that. And I guess the other thing about keeping your brain ahead of your fingers is that's when to be careful with the metronome. One of the things I was catching is that as I was practicing the iwi stuff is that there would be spots where I could get the metronome turned up to a point where I was still hanging on, but I wasn't really in control anymore. And it's like, yes, I'm playing it, but I'm not creating associations between the notes I'm playing and, what my fingers are doing, what the notes are on the page. That's starting to become very useless for me. It's not quite in the semantic satiation space, but it's starting to be useless. And it also, there's tension involved. So it's just one of those things where it's like, okay, stop, move on, work on something else. Constantly be in a state where you're actually doing the processing phase, reading enough music that you're creating those associations. And if you're not even to a point, this is something I take for granted still. If you're not to a point where you can work with a metronome consistently, if you can't play it without the metronome at a relatively consistent tempo, don't turn on the metronome. Or if you turn on the metronome and you're falling apart and you can't line up with the metronome, well, at least slow it down. And if you still can't line it up with the metronome, that probably means you're in some sort of a mental bandwidth deficit. You've run up against your limit of how much you can take in at one time. and your brain is so focused on still executing everything your hands are trying to do that you can tune out the metronome. So that's still a point where turn off the metronome and practice at what you are imagining is a consistent tempo, but probably isn't, until you can play it a little better, and then bring the metronome back in. The metronome is super important, but if you're not at a point where you can keep your brain ahead of your fingers, then it could be a detriment. Anyway, all that rambling, I guess I'm going to leave it there. I think I made some points, but anyway, I'm going to move on.